Hello, I'm Ted Gamble, Chair of the British Architectural Library Trust. The Trust is the nonprofit entity that supports the extraordinary library and collections of the Royal Institute of British Architects in London. This is the third presentation in our four-part 2026 lecture series, Brutalism, Architecture, Urbanism, and Representation. Today's lecture is titled The Brutalist Image. Brutalist architecture inherited the modern movement's photogenic qualities. Its bold, often monumental forms, sculptural qualities, and expressive volumes were perfectly suited to the sharp focus, high contrast imagery of mid-century architectural photography. Brutalism's rough surfaces of raw concrete, béton brut, or alternately exposed brickwork offered photographers the opportunity to explore textures and materiality. These aspects contributed to the creation of striking images that conveyed power and optimism. However, by the late 1960s and early 1970s, widespread disillusionment toward the achievements of post-war architecture and town planning opened the door for a more critical outlook. As architectural photographers and photojournalists became increasingly focused on street photography, the dramatic photographs of previous decades were replaced with grainier, more informal images. Today, in the midst of a continuing reappraisal and renewed appreciation of brutalist architecture, many photographers are rediscovering the same photogenic qualities that so inspired their mid-century predecessors. Our speakers today are both great friends of the British Architectural Trust. The lecture will be presented by Valeria Carullo. Valeria is the curator of the Robert L. Wall Photographic Collection at the Royal Institute of British Architects. Her principal area of research is the relationship between modern architecture and modern photography in the interwar years. An architect by background, Valeria writes and lectures regularly on both architecture and photography. She's the author of Monumental in Britain, 1935 to 1937, and an upcoming monograph on photographer Richard Bryant. She has also curated multiple exhibitions in Britain and internationally, including Wide Angle View, Architecture as Social Space, on the Architectural Review's Man Plan series of 1969 and 1970, Beyond Bauhaus, Modernism in Britain, 1933 to 1966, Eternal City, Rome and the Photographs collection of the Royal Institute of British Architects, and Rationalism on Set, Glamour and Modernity in 1930s Italian Cinema. Valeria is also the lead researcher of the RIBA's ongoing Refugee Committee project. Its first major output was the international conference, Displaced Lives, Architects Seeking Refuge on the Brink of World War II. The interlocutor for today's lecture is the noted architectural writer, editor, and consultant Hugh Pearman. Hugh currently serves as trustee and chair of C20, the 20th Century Society. For 30 years, Hugh served as the architecture and design critic for the Sunday Times and has been a frequent contributor to numerous other publications as well, including The Guardian, The Observer, The Wall Street Journal, and The New York Times. He also edited the RIBA Journal from 2006 to 2020. He was an honorary fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. He has also served on the advisory group for Arts Council England and chaired the Art for Architecture initiative at the Royal Society of Arts. He also serves on the Trust Advisory Council of the British Architectural Library Trust. He was served as a visiting professor of architecture at the Royal College of Art and is honorary vice president of the Architectural Association in London. Following Valeria's lecture, Hugh will join her for further conversation. And now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Valeria Carullo.
Thank you very much, Ted. I'm going to share my presentation now. I hope you can all see it. The first thing I want to say is that all the photographs, all the images that you will see in this presentation are from the RIBA collections, from the RIBA Photographs collection. In some cases, you will see some additional credits when necessary. So I really want to try with this lecture to give a sense of how brutalist architecture was communicated through photography and how, if at all, its visual representation has changed in subsequent decades, say between the 1960s, 70s, and now. But first, we have to go back all the way to the 19th century. As you probably know, the first photographic processes were announced in 1839, and within a few years, really quite quickly, photography's potential for architectural recording was recognized, as it was deemed to provide a really accurate record, accurate view of architecture. Photography offered three main advantages, we could say. First of all, it could show details not easily seen with the naked eye. Secondly, it was much farther than sketching. And finally, it offered what was seen as a faithful representation of reality. Obviously, we now know that's almost impossible, but that's certainly how photography was conceived at the time. Early photographers used traditional methods of representation, especially the elevation, as you can see here, and the two-point perspective. Many photographers were indeed originally painters. They had a background as painters or engravers. The photography of buildings was not seen as art, but was mostly seen as a means to convey information. Photographs were considered as neutral records and were often taken in even light, as you can see in this image. The personal view tended to be suppressed. But then, within a few decades, at the beginning of the 20th century, this happens, what we now call the new photography. In the 1920s, avant-garde artists such as Laszlo Molinari, Alexander Rodchenko, Albert Renger-Patch fostered a radical change both in the theory and in the practice of photography. They claimed its role as an independent art, with its own specific language that was distinct from that of centuries-old methods of visual representation. Photography was seen with cinema as the ultimate modern art, an offspring, we could say, of the age of technology, the age of machines. Its unique language was, in fact, the product of a machine, the camera, and of the effects produced by its main tool, its primary tool, which was light. There was a widespread use of experimental techniques such as photocollage, photomontage, abstract photograms, like the one that you see in this slide. But the most important innovation that affected the visual representation of architecture was the introduction of new, unusual, previously unfamiliar viewpoints, such as the bird's eye view, which is basically an elevated high-angle perspective looking directly down, or the worm's eye view, which is the opposite view, is a perspective taken from below looking straight up, as well as radical cropping, extreme close-ups. All these changes introduced a new way to look at architecture and the built environment. Just like photographers had done before them, architects started realizing that photography could do more than describe and represent. It could also interpret and convey ideas. Here is obviously a very famous view of a very famous building, Falling Water, taken by the fabulous partnership of Hedrick Blessing. It beautifully conveys the house's main architectural elements, as well as the location that gives the house its name. The use of a low camera angle and of filters that enhance the contrast make the image much more dramatic, obviously. And there's also an added element of dynamism given by this mostly diagonal composition. In the new photography, traditional perspective become, in a way, almost like obsolete, or they're definitely no longer obligatory. These elements are often present in the most striking, the most effective photographs of modern architecture of the 1920s and 30s. And these elements are unusual viewpoints, diagonal compositions, heightened contrast between light and shadow. As you can see also here, the simple bold forms of modern architecture and its smooth surfaces made of steel, concrete, glass provided the perfect subject material for this type of visual representation, which favored geometrical compositions. And this type of photography spread all over Europe and beyond, the United States and beyond. This is a beautiful image of a school in France. We are here in Prague, and notice the added drama provided by the clouds, which stand out as they are made lighter and the sky darker through the use of camera filters. A dramatic sky was indeed another common element in many architectural photographs of this period. Here we see another classic trick, the worm's eye view to convey height. I believe indeed that in this type of, in this period, for this type of photographs, the view conveys height more than monumentality, more than a sense of weight. Here's another real textbook example of the new photography's approach applied to architecture. The composition is entirely diagonal, very strong geometry, a strong tonal contrast, and the image is almost close to abstraction, I would say, even if it still really, I think, gives a sense of the three-dimensional space. It's a very dynamic composition. Here's another worm's eye view with very effective shadows. The role of cast shadows in the composition is another recurring element in this type of photography. And the materials used are light. For example, look at the balconies, and the surfaces tend to be smooth. We only see a more rugged aesthetic in photos of industrial buildings. Here's one, for example, a factory designed by Owen Williams with the exposed concrete and exposed brickwork. And the heating plant in Zurich. This image to me is almost like a present of how brutalist buildings will be photographed 30, 40 years later. And notice again the dramatic effect produced by the sky and this kind of the view looking straight up. So around 20 years later, the famous article, The New Brutalism by Rainer Banham, is published in the Architectural Review. The photographs to the left, which incidentally were taken by James Sterling, showing the recently completed chapel at Ronchamp by Le Corbusier, are not illustration for the article, but I can't imagine that they had been put there by chance. Later, Le Corbusier was in fact seen as a major influence on Brutalism. For example, the photographs taken by Le Corbusier's regular collaborator, Lucien Hervé, a Hungarian photographer transplanted in France. These images also appeared in the Architectural Review, and they must have made a really strong impact, I think, on the new generation of architects working in post-war Britain. As architectural photography historian Robert Elwood said about Lucien Hervé, quote, no photographer so well captured the sculptural plasticity and expressiveness of concrete. As you can see, Hervé's images also feature strong tonal contrast, powerful cast shadows, but the exposed concrete, I feel, gives them a different quality than the images that we've seen before, the images from the interwar period. As you've heard from the previous two lectures in this series, Banham considered the school at Constantin by Alison and Peter Smithson as one of the first examples of the new brutalism, which he describes in the article as, quote, our first native art movement, referring obviously to Britain. Beyond the significance of the article in establishing this new direction in architecture, I was especially interested in Banham's observations with regards to the image of these buildings. Again, as we heard in the previous lectures, for Banham, one of the three elements that define a new brutalist building is memorability as an image. And then he adds, remembering that an image is what affects the emotions. With regards to Hans Stanton being published in the Architectural Review about a year earlier in September 1954, he comments, here in three-dimensional and photographic reality and in classic modern movement materials of concrete, steel and glass, was the Smithson's only completed building. So it's interesting, really, this link that he makes between the reality of a completed building and its photographic representation, as well as the connections made with the pre-war modern movement. Many of the architects that now we refer to as brutalist architects did consider their architecture as a direct descendant of the modern movement, which had been in a way betrayed by the so-called Festival Britain style, which is, we could say, softer, gentler, and more understated, softer, gentler, more understated forms inspired by Scandinavian design, what we now refer to as mid-century modern. The architect and town planner Lionel Brett interestingly wrote in an article for the Architect's Journal in September 1957, I quote, "It was inevitable," he says, "that there would be a reaction from the rather feminine elegance of the South Bank exhibition with its light floating roofs and its lacy white balustrade. All that has gone with the new look, and in its place we have chunky masonry, heavy lintels, black painted tubular balustrades, and the brutal exposure of naked materials and services." Interesting also this definition of the new architecture as the new look. Obviously, this obvious parallel with the new look by Dior, which was obviously becoming very fashionable at the same time in the 50s. So a lot has been said, and much better than I could say, about this dichotomy between Brutalism and Festival Britain style by Owen Hopkins and Otto Somare-Smith in the two previous lectures of the series. And also Otto highlighted the gender description, again, the feminine elegance as it is described. So going back to Hans Stanton, Banham also states that the clear logic of its design contributes to the coherence of the building as a visual entity because it contributes to the building as an image. End of quote. He explains that this concept of image, which he says is common to all aspects of New Brutalism in Britain, requires that the building and the experience of the building in use should be kind of encapsulated in its image. Banham also adds that all great architecture has been image making. In the following couple of decades, this image of the building is powerfully communicated through photography. As we can see, the approach is very similar to that of the interwar years, but the architecture obviously has changed. So much has changed, in fact, as pointed out by architectural historian Ellen Harwood in her book Brutalist Britain. The post-war economic recovery in Britain prompted the biggest construction program the country had ever seen, from schools and houses and new buildings for entertainment and sport, to the remodeling of major city centres with offices, shops and car parks, and the building of whole new towns. One of these large-scale interventions took place in the Glasgow inner city area of Hutchinson Town, which was completely rebuilt following slum clearance. Just like the scale of this project is often unprecedented, the buildings have become bigger, bolder, their surface is no longer smooth. The reference to Le Corbusier here is very clear, and we cannot avoid, I think, thinking of Hervé's photograph we've seen before. There's a sense of weight, a sense of mass, of monumentality. Here we see again that disregard of conventional perspectives present in a new photography. This image to me seems to say this is the future, and even more so because of the presence of a small child in the foreground. A similar perspective is adopted here, introducing the architectural community to what is now one of the most iconic brutalist sites, the Barbican in London. This was indeed a period of megastructures, large units that covered a variety of functions within city centres, new towns or universities, and that replaced the traditional street pattern. Another example is the Tricon Centre in Portsmouth, demolished in 2004. We can appreciate here the sculptural qualities of many brutalist buildings and how they perfectly suited this sharp-focused, high-contrast imagery. A couple more images of the Tricon shopping centre. Here's another worm's eye view and a composition that is entirely diagonal. Both this characteristic inherited from the interwar period, but in this case, in these photographs, I think there's a real emphasis on the really solid volumes and on the textures of the raw concrete. Another wonderful example from this period, in this case, we have this curved blank volumes that are very sculptural, and the rough concrete and the exposed aggregate, and the wash concrete, hammer concrete in this case, offer photography the opportunity to really emphasize texture and materiality. In this image of the St. Peter's Seminary in Cardross, notice again the very strong, the extreme tonal contrast, the contrast also between the different types of concrete, smooth, rough, exposed aggregate, and also it's interesting the very effective use of reflections, which was another device, another trick, we could say, of interwar photography. And the same building, but seen from below. And notice how this kind of type of view and the cantilever volume add to the sense of monumentality. Again, another example of the dramatic use of light and shadow and how it helps to outline form and structure. This sunlight is really essential, an essential element in these images. See here how it highlights the pattern of voids and the texture of the concrete, as we've seen before. I'm going to show you a few more examples of this type of imagery adopted for Brutalist buildings. First of all, the Queen Elizabeth Hall in London. Again, notice the dramatic skies, the emphasis on the textures of materials. This interior, I think, really highlights the sculptural qualities of this particular building. And then we are in Gateshead. This is Trinity Square, the Trinity Square complex. This car park was, in fact, featured in a film, a very famous film, Get Carter, which was released only a few years later in 1971. The car park, unfortunately, was demolished in 2010. A great view from below. In the case of this building, the Brunel University, the use of the filter to increase contrast is so extreme that the sky is almost black, which is, again, not unusual in this type of imagery. Another interesting example is the what is now the Czechoslovak embassy at the time, now the Slovak embassy in London. It's another beautiful view from below that shows us again the different textures of the exposed concrete. This type of view, the Wormser view, the view from below looking up, is extremely common in this period, and I'm going to show you a few more examples just to really to highlight how recurrent a view this was and what a common device it was to represent and to depict these buildings. Variety of buildings by different architects in different locations in Britain. Again, really sculptural, the sculptural qualities, the shadows, the very contrasty images, they're all present and correct. Here's another early Brutalist building, the Old Vics Theatre Annex, which is now the National Theatre Studio. I would say that in the absence of windows, the sculptural quality of the concrete and of the forms adopted produces these wonderful, almost enigmatic structures. Of course, photography also helped the British architectural community to familiarize with Brutalist architecture in other parts of the world. And a few examples here. Sorry, not this one. This I meant to show you earlier. This is one of my favorite images. Yes, so here we are in Japan, in Spain, in Ireland, and in India. Architectural periodicals were, of course, the main conduit of these exchanges between different parts of the world and of dissemination of these images and of this type of architecture. In Britain, the Architectural Review, as you can see here, played a key role because from the interwar period, from the interwar years, it had given prominence to the photographic image and heavily relied on it to communicate with its audience. Images of Le Corbusier's work, as I mentioned earlier, were extremely important to the many architects in this country who could not travel, say, all the way to Chandigarh. In this illuminating article, the one that you see on the right, the editors combined images of Le Corbusier's work with images of buildings in Britain that they consider unmistakably influenced by the Swiss French architect. And the photographs here are used to this purpose. They allow a very direct comparison between Le Corbusier's work and these buildings inspired by it. In this double spread, the caption at the top of the right-hand page highlights the influence of late works of Le Corbusier on what they define as post-1950 brutalism, as if there was one before 1950. And in this case, they're referring to the pilotis at Gatwick Airport by York, Rosenberg, and Mardell, seen in the photograph on the left, and described as, quote, impeccably shuttered with the grain of the boarding left exposed. And here's their article on the assessment on Hutchinson Town, which is much less positive. As we see Le Corbusier influence, they describe it as, quote, the monumental tenement gone mad. And I really encourage you to read this truly scathing caption if you can get hold of this issue of the Architectural Review. As we have seen from the image of the Gatwick Airport pilotis, in this period, significant photographs often occupied the entire page. Here's Cambernauld New Town. Or, as in this case, for the South Bank Centre, a composition of 3 striking images filling the page. Often the photographs were printed at full bleed, like in this other double spread for the South Bank Centre, which makes them even more impactful, clearly. And I'll show you a few other examples. Here's a tricon again, Gateshead, we saw it a moment ago, and a university building by Leslie Martin. Here we have a really dramatic double spread on the Barbican. And this time, there's an unusual emphasis, just typical of these years in the Architectural Review, on the authors of the photographs. As you can see, Richard Einzig, Sam Lambert, and John Morby, they're almost billed at the same level as the architects, which is quite unusual, considering the war period, often photographs were not credited at all. And then, as we said earlier, the Architectural Review brought news from across the world. We can see here Kenzo Tange in Kurashiki, Place Bonaventure in Montreal, which I think Otto, I can't remember his exact word, but he described in his previous lecture as something like a capital of brutalism. There's the Boston City Hall, and again, look at how kind of gigantic how the building looks within the street pattern. An office building in Connecticut by SOM. The Exeter Library, New Hampshire by Louis Kahn. And the government building in Canberra by Harry Seidler and Associates. Brutalism also appears on the cover of the Architectural Review. We can see 4 here as an example. From the top left as the Barbican, August 1973. Clockwise from the top left, then we have the University of Reading by Howell, Killick, Partridge and Amis, November 73. The University of Leeds that we've seen again by Chamberlain, Powell and Bon, January 1974. And finally, an interesting hotel in Taormina in Italy, March 1974. So all these characteristics, the characteristics that I outlined in this presentation, I think really contribute to the creation of powerful images that conveys optimism and confidence in what I kind of define as a regeneration, of modern architecture. This is, we are the true heirs of modern architecture. That's what these architects and these buildings seem to say. However, in this same period, the Brutalist buildings had also been depicted using a very different approach. For example, by photographer John Donat, whose work was influenced by photojournalism and social documentary. This is, I think, a beautifully composed image, which again highlights the texture of the exposed concrete, but the presence of people casually captured as they happen to walk along the river gives the image, I think, a more dynamic feel. Here's John Donat again. The famous Trellick Tower is not photographed from below, as many photographers did before him and many photographers done after, but instead from a distance and with people in the foreground. This is Peter Bastow and the Preston bus station. Again, the subject is the bus station, but just as important are the people arriving and leaving and the vehicles moving about. And here's an image of a very crowded National Theatre in London again, teeming with life. Again, it's still an architectural photograph, but the focus is slowly shifting towards the people inhabiting or using the building. Here's a very unusual fisheye, the image taken with a fisheye lens of a school by Lyons, Israel, and Ellis, and also made more interesting, I think, and more dynamic by the presence of children in the foreground of the image. And talking about children, and this wonderful image by Sam Lambert of the famous Park Hill estate in Sheffield. The building almost recedes in the background, and the children are really almost in dialogue with the camera and very aware of the camera at the very least. And another superb image by John Donat, which I don't think needs any comment from me. I'm just going to leave it there for a second for you to enjoy. So this type of image had its heyday in the late 1960s, when widespread disillusionment towards the achievement of post-war architecture and town planning opened the door to a more critical outlook, as seen through the eyes of architectural photographers who were influenced by photojournalism, social documentary, and street photography. In these photographs, the high contrast, large format images of the previous 2 decades were replaced by grainier, more informal images taken often in flat light and populated by people. This approach, however, didn't last very long. And as for brutalism, in the last decades of the century, gradually fell out of favor, as we know, often branded as cold, as inhuman, as brutal. Large clearance schemes that allowed the building of the megastructures, for example, were blamed for a loss of community and of identity. In photography, color gradually supplanted black and white. Here we can see the National Theatre on the cover of the Architectural Review in January 1977 in color. And this cover was followed the same year by very different buildings. High tech is coming in. The Centre Pompidou, obviously in Paris. And then later in the year, the Hopkins House. The brutalist buildings, or the buildings that we now associate with brutalism, that never ceased to be considered high achievement of modern architecture, were seen in color for the first time. Here's a couple of examples: Cannes again, and Kenzo Tange. It's interesting how different these images are of the same buildings. I feel almost like it's color softens and black and white distills instead. They're less dramatic. They're possibly less impactful from a visual point of view. So I thought it would be interesting at this point to shortly address the opposition of black and white and color in photography. Already shortly after the war, a thought-provoking article appeared in the pages of the Architectural Review titled "Color and Modern Architecture, or the Photographic Eye." Its author was the painter Michael Rothenstein, and he acknowledged the synergy between photography and architecture. He, quote, said, "The camera has been the great publicist of modern architecture." But he also argues that the architect, and again I quote, "unconsciously influenced by the camera's interpretation, is himself in danger of developing the photographic eye," in capital letters, which sees in terms of black and white. Deploring the lack of color in the majority of contemporary British buildings, he is particularly concerned with the effect that photography might have on what he defines as untraveled and impressionable students by fostering a conception of architecture deficient of chromatic values, deficient of color. Protestant was not the only one to highlight the peculiarity of photography's black and white vision. It has been often pointed out that numerous buildings of the international style featured color surfaces, but their colors did not register in the public consciousness as they were mediated by the photographic image and therefore filtered through a black and white lens. As I said earlier, as brutalism became unfashionable in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, color took over in architectural photography. But in the new millennium, in the space of a few decades, a revaluation of brutalism has been followed by a steady rise in popularity to the point that now we can buy brutalist guides, postcards, all types of merchandise. Many architectural photographers have rediscovered in brutalist architecture the same photogenic quality that inspired that mid-century predecessors, and just like them, they capture this architecture in black and white. Notice again the clarity and the rich tone of these images, all taken many, many years after the buildings were erected. Also, the great use of cast shadows and the use of the view from below. The main difference is that now it seems to be acceptable to shoot in a grey light, which is possibly, in my opinion, a significant influence of both the late 1960s imagery and also contemporary art photography. That were buildings captured all over the world. I feel it's remarkable how many photographers are now devoting a significant part of their work to capture brutalist buildings. I'm just going to show you a few examples through the homepage of their websites. There are also contemporary photographers such as Joan de Hill, who are great admirers of brutalist architecture and are still keen to emphasize its great variety of textures, but they are doing it in color. All by the same photographer. And here again is how she presents her work on her website. Quite monochromatic. The architecture is monochromatic, but the images are in color. And also, I just wanted to show a really fun and quite different approach taken by photographer Hope Fitch. And he, a few years ago, quite recently, he had an exhibition of his photographs of brutalism in color, in which he obviously works on his images to make them quite original and unique. But generally speaking, it really looks like the visual representation of brutalism has come full circle. Our books are being published, and they're all in black and white, or mostly in black and white. Brutalist-themed photographic workshops are also very popular, again in black and white. What is it then about black and white? It's not easy to say, but photographers have often expressed the view that black and white allows for more creativity in their craft because the resulting image is more removed from reality. As the brilliant architectural photographer Eric de Marais, who worked in the 50s and 60s, put it, quote, a special quality of photography is the power it allows for the imaginative formalization of the outer world into a range of gray tones between black and white. Many photographers working in the 80s and 90s also used black and white Polaroids before shooting buildings in color as a device that helped them focus on composition and tonal range. The lack of color, therefore, seems to imply for many photographers an increased attention to other elements such as composition, geometry, the effect of light. So this concluding consideration really, I hope, can provide a clue to the enduring appeal that black and white photography offers. And when it comes to brutalist architecture, it looks like its current revival has also brought about the revival of its image. Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria. And good heavens, my face has gone strange. That's better.
It's all right.
I thought I
Sorry,
thought for a moment there that that bloke who colorizes brutalist architecture
yes,
had been at
Chris
work on
has
me.
also polarized you. No,
But
sorry.
yeah,
I
the
just
color
wanted
thing
to add very
is
briefly. Sorry, before I just want to add very briefly that that people can find all these images or most of these images on our online image database riverpix.com, which is what you see here on the screen.
your final exposition there on the use of color. I was particularly intrigued by, or amused, I should say, by that moment when the AR, the architectural review, breaks into color for the National Theatre, but it's still terribly monochrome because of what it's photographing. And then the next shot, we're back into black and white, and it's for actually quite a colourful building, the Pompidou Centre in Paris, which I think represents a moment, doesn't it? Because I suppose reaching back into my career in architectural journalism, what all the editors I ever worked with really loved about high-tech architecture was how shiny it was. And the shininess, which you would think would work in any medium, seemed to work particularly well in color as far as they were concerned. But then, they were into color anyway. They had color printing in newspapers, which they hadn't had until really quite late in the UK. So all these things come into play, I guess. But coming back to brutalism, I think you made a good point about shadow and texture as being really important for the photography of those buildings as opposed to the generally smoother buildings of the early pre-war period of modernism. But in all of these cases, apart from the ones, for instance, when John Donat started coming in and started showing people in the street, and then a building in the background, quite rare even today that, because normally the building is shot as if it's alone in space. It's rather like car advertisements on the telly where you never see any other brand of car but the one that's in the advertisement. I think it's Frank Gehry who made this point that architectural photography is so very selective that it only homes in on the subject it wants to see, whereas we as humans actually see a whole city, and there might be a building in that city. In your experience, does that brutalist moment where they start to show the people in the context of the buildings, was that a real moment of change?
I think it was, but maybe not a long-term change. That's
Yeah.
what I was obviously trying to say. I think it was significant, and it was. I mean, in the architectural review, obviously, we see it in a very evident way at the very end of the 60s with the Man Plan project. But clearly, John Donat had been photographing slightly different from the other photographers for a few years throughout the 60s. And the very first time, I think there was a photojournalist that took photographs of Sheffield. It was 1961 for architectural design. So there were some precedents, but for the architectural view, and therefore, as an example of a periodical that was widely read, that type of imagery wasn't that common at all, and it lasted for a relatively short time. I think there's now a bit more plurality in terms of how buildings are represented, and there's quite a few photographers I think that made their name now, photographers of architecture made their name because they have much more of an approach of including people and including the building in context. But at the same time, as I showed, there are all these photographers who actually really want to show the Brutalist building as object in a way, as a sculpture, as a kind of a bit isolated, as you said. But also the other thing I was thinking about when you were talking about the cover of which is supposedly in color, is also how, when I was researching for this presentation, how once again it sort of confirmed, in my view, how different it is to view the original photographs and then the photographs published in the periodic, which are in the end the photographs that people did see, because not many people saw the originals. And the architectural review, in a way, was probably the periodical that where this difference between the original image and the printed image was less pronounced, because they, especially for certain periods, they put so much effort into a really striking reproduction of their photography. But generally speaking, even them, as you said, with that cover of the National Theatre, for example, the quality of reproduction was often so like different from the quality of the original image. As thinking, especially say on the Architect's Journal, which was such a
Yes.
widely read periodicals, but probably a lot of the images that I showed today were also or published in the Architect's Journal, but quite small and printed quite badly, because it wasn't that important, I suppose. It was just,
Well,
again,
it's the perpetual agony of the Architecture magazine editor, Valeria, as I'm sure you're aware. You see the color proofs, and you can compare them to the photographs, and they don't look too bad. And then a magazine is printed, and then it's terrible, and the color is blurry, and it's lost its vibrancy, and it's just the world of magazines. You're printing at fairly low resolution, effectively over thousands and thousands and thousands of copies. So it is, but then again, it's only like an old-fashioned long-playing record, which is not the same as you'd hear in a concert hall. But we're used to it. We adjust to it, don't we? Our eyes adjust to a blurry magazine image. But yes, is it simply that, therefore, the black and white image is easier to reproduce in a magazine more faithfully? Is that your opinion?
Well, it certainly was. Not now, I would say, or probably what's happening now. You're probably more qualified to comment on than I am. But at the time, it was certainly, it took quite a while. It took well into the 80s, I think, if not, I would say the 90s, to get some really good color reproduction. Probably from the 80s already. But I remember flicking through a lot of architectural reviews and Architect's Journal. I remember when I was looking at Richard Bryant's production, color started to appear first in the adverts, then inside, and then on the covers. But it took quite a while for these color images to be reproduced, if not like faithfully at the same level of quality, but at a good level of quality. But and black and white, I imagine must have been a lot easier. But at the same time, as I said, I think it's always interesting to reflect on that really gap between the original photographic image and what people see in a magazine. Because, when you start thinking about how these images, what an impact the images had, you also think, yes, but I'm also looking at a pristine print rather than how people actually saw. That's why I feel it's so important to talk about the architectural review, because when I look at the architecture review, I think, yes, there was definitely that intention. They printed the images at full page. They obviously put some really, like special black inks. They wanted to be really punchy, really impactful. While for other magazines, again, the image was more like, again, information to convey information, and it didn't really matter how it looked and what impact it had, but it as long as it showed what the building looked like. That's why I feel it's, for me, from my point of view, it's always an interesting point of reflection, how images are reproduced, because in the end, that's how people see them. So
I'm interested also in, you described, and it comes out of architectural drawings to some extent, the worm's eye view or the bird's eye view, and the worm's eye view looking upwards. In the case of James Stirling, almost looking up from within the bowels of the earth to get that upwards image. But with a lot of those looking up at sort of dramatic angles on brutalist buildings, in a sense, it's just us in the street looking up, isn't it? It's really just that. Whereas that shifted, it seemed to me, thereafter into a much more, almost going back to those early Victorian examples, where you stand back from the building and you've got a what do you call it, a sliding whatnot lens on the camera, and you don't get converging verticals. Everything is entirely lined up, and you get a kind of beautiful but flat image of the facade of the building. But at that time, no, that wasn't what people wanted. It was an interesting switch, wasn't it?
Definitely. Also, I mean, what you were saying about that kind of view being sometimes what we see walking down the street, because we wouldn't go to the opposite building, go up on the third floor, and and look opposite. It's just it's interesting because one of the origins of this type of view, as at least is identified as the book that Eric Mendelsohn produced on New York and Chicago, America with a K, in the 20s, and he was one of the first. I mean, that obviously was walking through these canyons, the streets in Chicago, New York, and started tilting the camera up because, to photograph these skyscrapers, which were then so exciting when people saw them in Europe. And in a sense, it wasn't, like, I think the kind of common consensus, that wasn't a choice, aesthetic choice. It was literally like, this is what you see from the street. And this is, again, this sense of height and this sense of almost vertiginous, views. And it was to give that sense of, there was no other way for him to, because he wasn't a photographer, he was just walking around and looking up and abandoning perspective. It didn't matter anymore. So that was quite spontaneous in a way, and as you said, quite close to what you as a person would experience walking in those environments. But then it became kind of codified in the interwar photography, and became much more a style, like a stylistic choice, like because it had added drama, because it gave this sense of the almost like what we'd say now, like iconic. It gave this sense of this is a really important building, and we're looking at it from below. So I think it started being used in a more conscious way, and I think that's what they were doing as well with the Brutalist buildings. It feels in certain cases, obviously you have the whole range, the perfectly correct elevation and so on, and then these views from below, I think, also often allow some to really notice some details, some really interesting details. But certainly it seems an incredibly common viewpoint in that period, the view from straight up from below. So it's just, you can't help thinking this is deliberate.
Then another thing that struck me about some of those 1960s images was what's that reminding me of? What it's reminding me of is what I think of in Victorian photography as being the ragamuffins in the slums, where you've got street kids, and it's almost like documentary photography. You've got street kids in the slums of wherever, Whitechapel, and there they are in their rags on their doorsteps, and so on and so forth. Fast forward to 1963 or 4 or something, and you've got ragamuffins in playgrounds against the background. And that's actually seen as being quite exciting and human until you hit that moment. And a moment in your presentation was with that shot of, I think it was Cumbernauld Newtown, where you've got a kind of waste landscape with an old lady pushing a pram across nothingness and this slightly sinister looking construction in the background. And it's at that point that the photography, it seemed to me, changed from being here's the exciting modern world and here's the children in it to oh help, we're heading towards dystopia. And that's when you mentioned that it's grey London light, rather than the sunny skies and the deep shadows of the previous era. So there was that shift into, let's show this as being dystopia rather than being utopia, it seemed to me, at that point, which would have been about when?
It would have been, I would say, the very end of the 60s, which is, I think, that the key period. Obviously, there isn't a clear demarcation. I think once at least some photographers start looking at the built, it's rather than just the individual building, at the built environment with a slightly different or very different in some cases perspective, then I think it's almost inevitable that the view becomes the perspective changes. It's more about how things function and how people use them, and therefore if then they don't work and they don't function, and people are not, don't find, this brave, wonderful new world of modernity, and instead they, as you said, this kind of dystopian, then this starts showing in their photographs. That's my sense of what was happening then. And then, what, funnily enough, but then from in the 80s, all of a sudden, it all seems to disappear in photography. Everything was lovely and pristine and colorful.
Well, I mean,
It's not like
if I dare make a pop culture reference, I
please.
think, as we know, all of these things come around in circles. You would have, for instance, I don't know what, an early Beatles album cover, shall we say, and they're jumping in the air in their sharp boots on a Liverpool bomb site. It's a ruin. They're in a ruin in their sharp suits. Go forward to the punk and post-punk era, and suddenly, actually, the same young pop stars are now being shown in the context of high-rise brutalist blocks. The Jam. This is the modern world. It's the same thinking, isn't it? It's just across a different generation. It just recycles itself in that sense. I guess we're going to be seeing some sort of peeling bits of high tech appearing on album covers before too long.
Probably. Yeah, as I said, I don't know. I feel it's always more difficult to assess, obviously, the state of anything. In this case, for me, of photography in your, in your period, you lack that distance. But it seems to me there's a lot less, the more plurality. It's more difficult to identify a trend. There's definitely, from brutalism, I think the trend is definitely to go back to that type of really striking imagery, and which highlights the sculptural qualities, or the qualities brought about by light and sunlight. But yeah, if we talk about brutalism, I think for most of what you see, and it's, in a way, it is a rediscovery of something of the past. It's not photographing contemporary architecture. So that's why I think it's interesting in that sense. It's like, it's a revival of not only of the architecture, but of that image, that it had at the time, even if obviously it can't be exactly the same because we are in 2026. But yeah, but otherwise, thinking about the photography architecture in general, the built environment, there's so much, there's so much variety. It's difficult to say this is the trend for me, if somebody asked, but not that you did.
I've got one last question, which actually is not to do with brutalism. And this will be a short answer one, and then I'll hand back to Ted. And that is, has the drone killed architectural photography? In that suddenly you've got a million amateurs flying drones showing everything from the air. Most buildings were not designed to be seen from the air. And that's when you start, maybe this might lead to the current phenomenon of everything having to have a roof garden. But it's it's the case, isn't it, that after the worm's eye view, suddenly the bird's eye view is absolutely everything, it would appear, in popular culture. Is that now creeping into the RIBA collection? Any of that?
Not quite, not yet. Even contemporary acquisitions are still quite conventional, so to speak. There's so much going on with imagery of the built environment at the moment. As you said, drone photography, or filming, or let's not mention the word, AI and CGI and everything. But I don't know. As I said, I feel it's one of the components, certainly the drone image, and also it reminds me of how, like at the beginning of the 20th century, all of a sudden the discovery of this incredible discovery of viewing cities and buildings from the air, with aerial photography. It's not quite the same, but it's a strong parallel, and how that type of view. So it's interesting in relation to what you asked, even if I don't have an answer, because that view, the area of photography, seemed to have been also one of the influences on the development of modern architecture, and looking at the environment in a different way, in a more abstract way as well. That distance and abstracting things and pattern and finding patterns. So I think it's a really interesting kind of topic, that one of aerial photography, that probably, could find interesting parallels with, a century later with what's happening now with drones. But I haven't done a lot of thinking on it, I'm afraid, yet.
Well, we shall see.
To
Anyway,
be continued.
Valeria, that was a tremendous. Well, actually, you took us through an awful lot of history there, as well as through the Brutalist period. So thank you for that. And at this point, Ted, I will hand back to you.
Thank you. I'd actually like to thank both Hugh and Valeria for an outstanding program. Valeria, some of those images with these vast plazas, monumental forms, and high contrast light, it almost reminded me of De Chirico. And you at some point you wonder, are you really looking at the forms, or are you looking at the fact that there are no people there? It was fascinating. But thank you. I'd like to remind everyone the topic and date of our upcoming fourth and final lecture in the series, Brutalism Today and Tomorrow, will be presented on Thursday, April 23rd. Our speaker will be Barnabas Calder, and Hugh Pearman will serve as interlocutor. And information on the British Architectural Library Trust, its activities and programs, and other upcoming lectures and events can be found on our website, thebaltrust.org. Thank you very much for joining us.